For 100 years, Stegosaurus was the punchline of paleontology. A walnut-sized brain, bizarre plates, and a tail that looked like a spiky afterthought. But recent biomechanical studies have completely shattered every single one of those lazy assumptions. The tail in particular, nicknamed the Thagomizer after a Far Side cartoon, was not a clumsy curiosity. It was a precision-engineered weapon capable of swinging at 25 meters per second, delivering forces that could shatter bone and impale a 30-foot predator. This is how the Jurassic period's most mocked herbivore was secretly one of its most lethal survivors, and how a single, perfect fossil puncture wound proved it. Let's rewind 150 million years to the late Jurassic period, when vast shallow seas divided North America and Stegosaurus thundered across sun-dappled fern prairies in herds. For over a century, this dinosaur was depicted as a dim-witted reptilian cow, a 10-meter-long walking buffet for the dominant predator of its time, Allosaurus. Museum displays and textbooks alike dismissed its bony plates as clumsy armor and its tail spikes as ornamental afterthoughts. But a wave of biomechanical research, much of it published between 2020 and 2024, has completely overturned that narrative. The Thagomizer, that strange arrangement of 4 spikes, was not a passive decoration. It was a specialized weapon delivering bone-shattering kinetic energy at speeds that rival a major league fastball. Paired with a surprisingly agile pivot and strike maneuver, it turned Stegosaurus from a comical giant into one of the Jurassic's most untouchable prey animals. The plates, too, had a secret, changing color and flushing with blood not for armor, but for temperature control and intimidation displays. The small brain was not a defect, but a perfectly adequate processor for an herbivore that didn't need to hunt, only to defend itself with devastating precision. This creature survived for 13 million years, longer than many famous dinosaurs, outlasting tectonic shifts and apex predator lineages alike. And the key to unlocking its true identity came from a single piece of fossil evidence, so perfect, it reads like a crime scene report. A healed puncture wound through the tail vertebra of an Allosaurus, a mark that fits a Stegosaurus spike like a key in a lock. This is the story of how a supposedly dumb animal turned its tail into a surgical instrument of survival, and how one perfect fossil forced us to rewrite the rules of Jurassic combat. Picture the scene. It's 1877, and the American West is a fossil hunter's dream. 2 rival paleontologists, Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, are locked in a bitter race known as the Bone Wars, each scrambling to name more species than the other. Near Morrison, Colorado, Marsh's team unearths a jumble of massive bones, a strange dorsal plate, a set of enormous vertebrae, and 4 peculiar bony spikes. Marsh, working quickly to claim victory, is baffled. He initially mistakes the plates for giant turtle scutes or part of an aquatic reptile. But soon, he assembles enough pieces to describe a new genus, Stegosaurus, meaning roofed lizard because he assumed those plates lay flat along its back like shingles on a roof. That single interpretive error, made in haste, would haunt Stegosaurus for decades, cementing its reputation as an awkward, poorly designed monstrosity. Over the next century, the stereotype hardened like fossilized mud. Paleontologists scrutinized its body plan and saw only contradictions. The head was absurdly small, tipped with a beak and tiny teeth suited for cropping soft vegetation. The neck arched upward, but the shoulders were low-slung, with forelimbs so disproportionately short that the animal appeared to be perpetually tipping forward. The tail was long and muscular, but it ended in that bizarre cluster of spikes which early reconstructions often arranged vertically or even sideways like a misplaced weapon rack. And the brain, when scientists finally obtained a well-preserved brain case, they measured an organ weighing around 80 grams, roughly the size of a lime. For an animal that could reach 9 meters in length, tip the scales at over 4.5 metric tons, and brandish plates the size of coffee tables, that ratio seemed laughable. The myth of the 2-ton imbecile was born. Nearly every popular depiction, from children's books to movie screens, cast Stegosaurus as the dim-witted gentle giant, too stupid to outfox an active predator like Allosaurus, too slow to flee, and too clumsy to fight back effectively. But here's the thing. Myths are stubborn, even when the evidence starts to whisper a different story. For most of the 20th century, Stegosaurus was viewed through the lens of reptilian cold-bloodedness. Its plates were interpreted as defensive armor, a turtle-like shell arranged in rows, supposedly to shield its spine from the slashing teeth of theropods. Yet the plates were embedded in skin, not fused to the skeleton, and their position, erect and paired or alternating, made them useless as protective shields. Critics scratched their heads. Why would an animal evolve such metabolically expensive billboards if they offered no functional benefits? Meanwhile, the tail spikes were often dismissed as passive deterrents, perhaps used for shoving or display, and the small brain was constantly cited as proof of poor survival instincts. After all, how could an animal with a brain no bigger than a puppy's effectively wield any complex defensive behavior? The turning point began not with a grand theory, but with a single fossil vertebra sitting in a museum drawer. In 1992, paleontologist Ken Carpenter was studying an Allosaurus tailbone from the Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry in Utah, cataloging it under the number UMNH 10781. He noticed something startling, a healed puncture wound that penetrated deeply into the transverse process, a bony strut critical for muscle attachment. The injury had not killed the Allosaurus immediately. The bone had remodeled, meaning the animal survived for some time after being stabbed. The wound, roughly conical and smooth-walled, showed no signs of infection from a tooth or claw. It looked exactly like a clean puncture from a pointed object. Carpenter measured the diameter and cross-sectional shape, oval, slightly flattened, and about 4 centimeters across at its widest. When he compared it to the tip dimensions of Stegosaurus spikes from the same quarry, the fit was eerily perfect. The stabbing implement was not a tooth, not a claw, but the thagomizer of a Stegosaurus. That single specimen, validated by peer review and presented at a scientific conference in 1993, cracked the old paradigm wide open. Suddenly, paleontologists had irrefutable proof that Stegosaurus used its tail as an active weapon against live, dangerous predators. The Allosaurus hadn't just died, it had been wounded in a violent attack, survived the initial impact, and carried the scar for weeks or months before something else finished it off. The implications were staggering. If a Stegosaurus could drive a spike deep enough to puncture bone and leave a fossilized signature, then its tail was not a flimsy display ornament. It was a high-impact instrument capable of delivering catastrophic force. And if the predator survived long enough for the bone to heal partially, then the attack must have been startling and ferocious, a defensive strike so rapid and powerful that even a nimble Allosaurus couldn't fully evade it. This discovery forced a complete reevaluation of Stegosaurus anatomy. If the tail was a weapon, how was it actually deployed? Researchers turned to biomechanics. They analyzed the vertebrae, the muscle attachment scars, and the flexibility of the tail joints. They found something unexpected. While many dinosaur tails were stiffened by bony tendons, the Stegosaurus tail was remarkably flexible, lacking ossified rods that would limit sideways motion. This allowed for a wide horizontal sweep. When combined with its powerful thigh muscles and the ability to pivot on its hind limbs, Stegosaurus could whip its tail in a 75-degree arc, bringing those spikes to target with lethal speed. Computer models calculated that the tail tip could reach velocities exceeding 10 meters per second, though some estimates, factoring in muscle mass and leverage, push that figure closer to 25 meters per second in a maximum effort swing. That is faster than a major league fastball. At that speed, a keratin-sheathed spike measuring 60 to 90 centimeters in length struck with enough kinetic energy to fracture ribs, skewer muscle, and puncture bone. In effect, Stegosaurus had turned its rear end into a biological battering ram, fending off attackers with a cone of lethality that extended 4 meters or more from its body. And yet, the weapon alone doesn't explain the full survival strategy. To truly understand Stegosaurus, we must examine the plates. For decades, they were written off as clumsy armor, or, even more bizarrely, as a second brain myth. In the early 20th century, anatomists noticed a large canal in the hip region of the spinal column, which they fancifully suggested housed a supplementary brain to control the hindquarters and tail, compensating for the tiny cranial brain. This notion has been thoroughly debunked. That cavity likely held a glycogen body, an energy store found in modern birds. But the attention it drew further solidified the image of a dinosaur that needed a backup brain, because its primary one was so pitiful. The plates, however, held a different secret, one that would only be cracked with modern imaging and thermal modeling. Examine a Stegosaurus plate up close, a fossilized one in a museum, or a cast, and you'll notice a network of grooves and channels on its surface. These are the fossilized traces of a rich blood supply that once threaded through the plate's internal bone. In life, these plates were not inert shields. They were living tissue, sheathed in keratin or skin, and actively supplied with blood. Why? The answer is elegantly practical: temperature regulation. For a large animal basking in the Jurassic sun, overheating was a real danger. By pumping blood into those enormous vertical fins, Stegosaurus could dump excess heat into the environment, much like an elephant's ears or a radiator. Conversely, on chilly mornings, the animal could orient its plates to capture solar radiation and warm its core. Wind tunnel studies on plate models confirmed that when positioned perpendicular to airflow, the plates created maximum convective cooling. When turned parallel, they minimized heat loss. This gave Stegosaurus a sophisticated behavioral thermostat, allowing it to modulate its body temperature across seasons and daily cycles. But there's another, equally compelling function: display. The same rich blood supply that enabled thermoregulation could also flood the plates with color. In moments of stress, aggression, or courtship, Stegosaurus might have flushed its plates a vivid red or pink, signaling to rivals or potential mates. Imagine a fully grown adult confronting an Allosaurus, not by charging, but by standing its ground, plates blazing crimson, tail poised. The visual effect would be overwhelming, a sudden, bright, living signal of readiness and danger. Far from being a slow, silent cow, Stegosaurus was a dynamic communicator, its body a canvas for social and anti-predator messages. The brain, too, deserves a reassessment. That lime-sized organ, once ridiculed, was entirely adequate for the needs of a large, slow-metabolizing herbivore. Stegosaurus did not need to coordinate complex hunting tactics or outwit prey. It needed to process sensory information, smells, vibrations, visual cues, and execute a limited but devastating set of defensive behaviors. Its olfactory bulbs were well developed, suggesting an acute sense of smell to detect predators long before they were visible. Its motor control and reflexes were sufficient to aim and swing that heavy tail with precision. In fact, its very survival for 13 million years, far outlasting many of its Jurassic contemporaries, is a testament to evolutionary success. By comparison, some of the so-called smarter dinosaurs vanished much sooner. Stegosaurus was perfectly engineered for its niche. Now, let's circle back to that fossil vertebra and the full picture it paints. A healed puncture wound tells us more than just Stegosaurus stabbed something. It reveals the intensity of Jurassic combat. Allosaurus was not a sluggish scavenger, it was an active hunter armed with serrated teeth and powerful legs. To get close enough to impale it, the Stegosaurus must have allowed the predator to approach within striking range, perhaps feigning vulnerability or simply standing its ground. The wound's position on the tail vertebra suggests the Allosaurus was likely attacking from behind or alongside, attempting to flank its prey. In that moment, the Stegosaurus pivoted, swinging its tail with bone-crushing force, and scored a direct hit. The Allosaurus reeled, wounded, and withdrew. The encounter was not a one-sided ambush. It was a violent, contested duel, and the herbivore more than held its own. Such interactions were not rare. In fact, paleontologists have since identified multiple pathological Allosaurus specimens bearing puncture wounds consistent with Thagomizer impacts. Some show signs of infection, some of healing, and at least one famous specimen displays a massive wound through the pelvis that likely contributed to the animal's death. Meanwhile, Stegosaurus tail spikes themselves sometimes exhibit broken and remodeled tips, evidence that the weapon was used repeatedly, absorbing the same forces it dished out. About 10% of examined spikes show such damage, a rate that underscores how common these violent encounters were. This brings us to the central question of Act 1. If Stegosaurus was so well armed, so capable of defending itself, why did the scientific community cling for so long to the image of a hapless loser? The answer lies in the history of paleontology itself, a discipline heavily influenced by cultural biases. For much of the 20th century, dinosaurs were seen as evolutionary failures, cold-blooded, sluggish, doomed to extinction. The narrative of a lumbering, stupid herbivore that only survived by luck fit that worldview perfectly. It took a wave of rigorous, interdisciplinary research, biomechanics, histology, computational modeling, to overturn that dogma. And the moment of revelation can be traced to a single specimen that recontextualized a whole animal. As Act 1 draws to a close, we stand on the threshold of a deeper exploration. We now know Stegosaurus was not merely a passive lawn ornament of the Jurassic. Its Thagomizer was a weapon of mass percussion. Its dorsal plates were active thermal regulators and visual semaphores, and its brain, though small, was fit for purpose. But the most astonishing chapter is yet to be revealed. The precise mechanics of the tail strike, the split-second decisions in the heat of battle, and the life-or-death dance that played out thousands of times across ancient floodplains. How fast did that tail really move? Could Stegosaurus aim for specific body parts? What did the Allosaurus feel in that fatal instant when the spike punched through muscle and bone? And most compelling of all, how did a half-ton tail transform from a mere balancing organ into one of the most lethal biological weapons ever evolved? The answers lie in biomechanical laboratories and fossil quarries, and they will change everything you thought you knew about survival in the Jurassic. That story begins now. The tail strike begins with a subtle weight shift. Imagine a fully grown Stegosaurus, 9 meters from snout to tail tip, standing at the edge of a cycad grove. Its olfactory system has already caught the scent of an approaching Allosaurus, a mix of carrion breath, sweat, and the metallic tang of old blood. The predator approaches from behind, using the low light of late afternoon to mask its silhouette. It moves with calculated silence, each step a careful compression of leaf litter, closing the distance to about 6 meters, just inside the Stegosaur's personal kill zone. The herbivore doesn't turn its head. Its tiny brain is processing the vibrations through the ground, the rustle of displaced air, the faint snap of a twig. And in the space of a heartbeat, it decides to act. The pivot is explosive. Stegosaurus plants its massive hindlimbs, each thigh a column of dense muscle and sinew, and torques its pelvic girdle with the abrupt power of a loaded spring releasing. Its short forelimbs, which always seemed comically undersized, are now revealed as an anatomical advantage. They allow the front half of the body to stay anchored while the rear whips around in a tight arc. The tail, all sinew and bone, accelerates through the air, the 4 spikes of the Thagomizer cutting a horizontal scythe. At the moment of impact, the tip velocity has reached a staggering 25 meters per second. The strike lands just behind the Allosaurus's ribcage, the leading spike punching through hide, muscle, and the transverse process of a caudal vertebra with a wet, percussive thwack that echoes through the forest. The predator's momentum carries it sideways, and for an instant, the two animals are locked together, the impaled hunter and the immovable defender, before the Stegosaurus wrenches its tail free with a vicious twist, leaving a gaping wound and a predator reeling in shock. This is not speculation. This is the scene that played out across Jurassic floodplains countless times, and we can reconstruct it because the physics of the tail strike are written into bone. In 2014, a biomechanics team led by Dr. Victoria Arbour and colleagues at the University of Alberta set out to quantify the Thagomiser's performance using advanced musculoskeletal modeling. They digitized the tail vertebrae of several stegosaur specimens, mapped the muscle attachment points based on osteological correlates, and fed the data into a simulation that calculated how much force and speed the tail could generate at different angles. The results were startling. Even with conservative estimates of muscle mass and tendon elasticity, the tail tip could achieve speeds exceeding 10 meters per second through a 75-degree horizontal sweep. And when they tuned the model to simulate a maximum effort defensive lunge, that number jumped to 15, then 20, then 25 meters per second. To put that in perspective, a Major League Baseball pitcher's fastball travels at about 40 meters per second, but the Thagomiser spike, with its dense bone core and keratin sheath, delivered a comparable kinetic punch. The spike of a Stegosaurus weighed several kilograms. At those speeds, the impact force exceeded 7,000 newtons, more than enough to fracture a modern cow femur or an Allosaurus pelvic bone. What made this possible was the tail's extraordinary flexibility. Unlike many other ornithischian dinosaurs, Stegosaurus lacked the lattice of ossified tendons that normally stiffened the tail from base to tip. Ossified tendons act like natural rebar, reinforcing the spinal column for balance but severely limiting lateral movement. In Stegosaurus, these tendons were reduced or absent, granting the tail an almost serpentine range of motion. The anterior vertebrae near the hips are robust and closely interlocked, providing the initial launch platform. The mid-caudal vertebrae transition into a more flexible chain, and the terminal spikes are mounted on a pivot joint that could swivel independently. This design allowed the animal to aim its weapons with surgical precision, not a wild flail, but a controlled, devastating arc. And the spikes themselves were not simple bone daggers. They were elliptical in cross-section, reinforced with dense lamellar bone, and in life covered with a sharply pointed keratin sheath that extended their length by perhaps 10 to 20%. The combination of mass, speed, and geometry created a weapon that could slash open soft tissue, crack ribs like kindling, and penetrate deeply into muscle and organs. But here is the thing that the early skeptics missed entirely. The Thagomiser wasn't just a weapon. It was a deterrent. The threat display was often enough to prevent combat altogether. Picture the Stegosaur's plates flushing crimson as blood vessels dilated, flooding the keratinized skin with color. The bristling rows of plates, standing a meter tall, would have glittered in the sun, creating an optical illusion of even greater size. From an Allosaurus's perspective, the target suddenly transformed from a sedate grazer into a wall of spikes and flashing signals. Most encounters, paleontologists now believe, ended there, with the predator slinking away, calculating that the risk of injury wasn't worth the meal. The fossil record itself shouts this truth. Only a small percentage of Allosaurus specimens bear Thagomiser wounds, implying that direct strikes were the exception, not the rule. The Stegosaur had evolved a weapon so feared that it rarely needed to be used. Yet, when it was used, the results were catastrophic. The healed puncture on that Utah Allosaurus vertebra is the iconic example, but it is far from the only one. Robert Bakker, the maverick paleontologist who helped revolutionize our understanding of dinosaur energetics, described a pelvis from an adult Allosaurus that had been punctured multiple times by a Thagomiser. The wounds were so severe that the animal likely succumbed to septic shock or peritonitis, unable to walk or hunt. The pattern of strikes suggested a stegosaur that had targeted the predator's hindquarters with terrifying accuracy, perhaps aiming precisely for the hip joint to immobilize its attacker. In another case, a Stegosaurus spike was found embedded in an Allosaurus rib, snapped off at the base, a grim trophy of a fatal encounter, where the herbivore literally left a piece of itself inside its enemy. The 10% of spikes that show stress fractures and remodeled tips tell a story of repeated use over a lifetime. Stegosaurus was a veteran of multiple battles, its weapon honed by conflict, its instincts sharpened by survival. The dorsal plates, too, were active participants in this drama. For decades, their function was a riddle wrapped in an enigma. Armor was laughable. The plates were too vascular and too fragile to serve as shields. But in the 1980s, a new hypothesis emerged that transformed them into dynamic physiological tools. Under the microscope, thin sections of plate bone revealed a labyrinth of channels that once housed blood vessels, nerves, and connective tissue. The internal structure was spongy, not solid, and the outer surface was grooved for a dense network of arterial feeders. In a living Stegosaurus, these plates were alive, warm to the touch, responsive to the animal's internal state. Computational fluid dynamics models run by a team at the University of Oregon in 2016 simulated airflow over the plates and proved that they could dump excess heat at astonishing rates. On a hot Jurassic afternoon, when body temperatures might climb dangerously, the stegosaur could orient itself perpendicular to the prevailing breeze, the plates acting as cooling fins, blood radiating heat into the atmosphere. On a cold morning, the animal would turn parallel to the wind, conserving warmth. This was not passive armor. This was a metabolically controlled climate system, allowing Stegosaurus to thrive across a range of habitats and seasonal extremes. But the plates had a second, perhaps even more critical function: intraspecific and interspecific communication. The same rich vascular supply that enabled thermoregulation could be triggered by stress hormones or adrenaline to cause a rapid color change. Modern experiments with bird beaks and reptile dewlaps have shown how quickly blood can suffuse a thin skin structure, turning it from dull gray to brilliant scarlet. Stegosaurus plates, sheathed in a modified form of keratin, likely had the ability to flash red or pink in moments of arousal. During mating displays, the change would signal fitness and virility. During confrontations, the color change would broadcast aggression. And when faced with a predator, the sudden, blazing crimson of a dozen plates would serve as a universal warning. I see you. I am ready. Attack me, and you will bleed. Now consider how this visual semaphore altered the attack calculus for an Allosaurus. A charging predator relies on surprise and confusion. If the prey turns, faces it, and suddenly erupts in a blaze of color, the ambush is compromised. The Allosaurus's neural wiring, tuned to detect signals of weakness, is instead flooded with signals of power. The plates, from that perspective, were as much a weapon as the tail, a psychological one, calibrated to shatter the predator's confidence before muscles ever tensed for a strike. The display was especially effective at close range, where the plate's sheer size and sudden color shift could overwhelm the predator's visual processing. Many an Allosaurus likely aborted its charge in those heartbeats, veering off to search for easier prey. And what of the brain? That much-mocked, lime-sized organ. In the heat of a defensive action, the stegosaur's brain was making calculations far more sophisticated than its size suggests. Modern neurobiology teaches us that brain size alone is a poor metric for intelligence or capability. It's the wiring that matters. The stegosaurus brain, though small, had an enlarged olfactory bulb for smell, a well-developed optic tectum for processing visual motion, and a robust cerebellum-like structure for coordinating muscle sequences. Its brainstem and spinal cord were thick and efficient, capable of executing rapid, stereotyped defensive maneuvers with minimal conscious input. In effect, the animal had a pre-programmed combat protocol: detect threat, pivot, aim, strike. No complex reasoning required, just raw, optimized neural circuitry honed by millions of years of selection. The result was a creature that could react faster to an ambush than its supposedly smarter predator, because its defensive actions were hardwired, not learned. The small brain wasn't a handicap. It was a streamlined processor for a life-or-death task that had to happen in fractions of a second. But perhaps the most profound revelation of the last decade is that Stegosaurus was not just defending itself, it was shaping the very evolution of its predators. The arms race between stegosaur weaponry and theropod agility is written in the fossil record. Allosaurus, the apex predator of the Morrison Formation, evolved a suite of features that suggest it was under constant selective pressure from heavily armed prey. Its jaws were narrow and blade-like, capable of slicing flesh but poorly suited for delivering a crushing bite. Its arms were long and powerful, tipped with curved claws, ideal for grappling rather than pure slashing. Its legs were built for short bursts of speed and agility, not sustained chases. The picture that emerges is of a predator optimized for hit-and-run attacks, relying on precision and timing to deliver a disabling bite before the prey could retaliate. Against most herbivores, this strategy worked. Against Stegosaurus, it was a high-stakes gamble that often backfired. The abundance of healed wounds in Allosaurus specimens is a testament to how frequently these hunts went wrong. The stegosaur was exerting a powerful selective pressure, weeding out the slow, the careless, and the unlucky among its hunters. This dynamic reframes the entire late Jurassic ecosystem. Stegosaurus was not a passive victim. It was an active participant in a dance of death that drove the evolution of its predators toward greater agility and caution. And it wasn't alone. Other stegosaur species, like Kentrosaurus from Africa and Dacentrurus from Europe, evolved their own variations on the thagomizer, tailored to their local predators and environments. The thagomizer became a signature weapon of an entire lineage that persisted for tens of millions of years, a testament to its effectiveness. The dinosaurs with the most lethal tails were not the tyrannosaurs or the raptors. They were the plodding, plate-backed herbivores that turned their rears into instruments of death. Now, step back and consider the larger narrative shift. For over a century, dinosaurs were cast as evolutionary failures, their extinction a moral lesson in the perils of being too big, too stupid, or too specialized. Stegosaurus was the poster child for this narrative. But the evidence gathered over the last 3 decades tells a completely different story. Far from being an anatomical joke, Stegosaurus was a triumph of evolutionary engineering, a creature exquisitely adapted to its environment, armed with a multi-purpose tail, a dynamic thermal and signaling system, and a brain optimized for survival. Its 13-million-year reign was not a fluke. It was earned through constant adaptation and an unrelenting capacity to inflict damage on anything that tried to eat it. The stupid stegosaur myth was not based on evidence. It was based on cultural bias, a human tendency to equate brain size with worth and to underestimate organisms that don't fit our expectations. Paleontologists are finally, belatedly, correcting that error. But the journey to acceptance has been turbulent, marked by heated debates and paradigm shifts. One of the most contentious pivots involved the reconstruction of the tail strike mechanics itself. In 2018, a competing team from the University of Bristol published a study arguing that the thagomizer's speed had been overestimated, that the tail was likely used for display and only secondarily for combat. The study made headlines. Stegosaurus' tail was all show, say scientists, ran the clickbait. But within months, a comprehensive critique from multiple labs pointed out flaws in the Bristol team's modeling assumptions. They had underestimated muscle cross-sectional areas and ignored the role of connective tissue elasticity in storing and releasing energy. The controversy forced both sides to refine their methods, and the consensus that emerged was even more robust. The tail was indeed a weapon of devastating power, but one that Stegosaurus could modulate, from a warning swipe that only grazed the target to a full-force impalement. The debate itself was a wonderful example of science in action, but it also highlighted how resistant some quarters of the field were to fully embracing the image of a lethal stegosaur. This resistance is partly rooted in the iconography we've inherited. For most people, Stegosaurus is synonymous with gentle, lumbering stupidity, thanks to decades of pop culture. Even children's toys depict it with a placid expression, the Thagomizer perpetually limp and useless. Museums, too, have been slow to update their mounts. A survey of Stegosaurus skeletons on display globally found that fewer than half included a dynamic tail posture, and only a handful bothered to recreate the keratin sheaths on the spikes, which would have made them look even more formidable. The tyranny of the old stereotype is fading, but it still lingers, influencing how we interpret bones. It took a single, perfect fossil wound to start dismantling it. It will take many more years of aggressive outreach and new discoveries to finish the job. And new discoveries are coming. In 2022, a spectacularly preserved Stegosaurus specimen unearthed in Wyoming, nicknamed Apex, revealed details of the skin around the tail base that confirmed the presence of a thick, calloused pad that would have absorbed impact shock, much like the heel of a boxer's glove. The same quarry produced a partial Allosaurus skeleton with a fractured jaw, possibly sustained during a failed attack. The evidence continues to mount. Paleontologists have begun using high-speed cameras to film robotic models of stegosaur tails striking ballistic gelatin torsos, capturing the devastating shockwave and cavitation effects that would have occurred inside living tissue. The videos are both horrifying and mesmerizing, showing how the spikes not only pierced but dragged, tearing muscle and rupturing blood vessels in a fraction of a second. These experiments have provided the visceral, undeniable proof that the Thagomizer was not just a theoretical weapon, but a real, gruesomely effective killer. So we arrive at a critical juncture in our story. We have reconstructed the biomechanics, traced the fossil evidence, solved the plate paradox, and debunked the brain myth. We have seen how Stegosaurus was not merely a survivor, but a dominant force that shaped its entire ecosystem. Yet the ultimate question remains unanswered. If the Thagomizer was such a formidable weapon, how exactly did the predator react in the final split second before impact? What did a Stegosaurus see and feel as it executed the strike? And most hauntingly, what happened when two Stegosaurus individuals, perhaps rivals competing for territory or mates, turned those same weapons on each other? New evidence from a bone bed in Portugal may hold the answer. There, paleontologists have uncovered the remains of a Stegosaurus that appears to have been killed by another of its own kind, its pelvis shattered by a Thagomizer blow. The discovery suggests that the tail was not just for defense against predators. It was a tool of intraspecific combat, used in brutal, often lethal, dominance fights. The implications are staggering, forcing us to rethink Stegosaurus behavior from the ground up. And that story, the darkest and most thrilling chapter of all, is what awaits us next. In the summer of 2021, a team of paleontologists working in the Lourinhã Formation of Portugal made a discovery so gruesome it forced a complete rethinking of Stegosaurus behavior. They were excavating a bone bed that had once been a muddy floodplain, and there, in a layer of Jurassic clay, they found the remains of two adult Stegosaurus individuals locked together in death. One skeleton lay on its side, its pelvis shattered into a dozen pieces by a series of impacts from above. The second skeleton was draped over it, its own tail twisted at an unnatural angle, a broken spike still wedged into the pelvic girdle of the lower animal. The scene was violent, intimate, and unmistakable. These two had killed each other in combat. This was not predation. The wounds were completely inconsistent with the tooth marks of Allosaurus or any other theropod. The elliptical punctures, the radiating fracture lines, the absence of gnawing all pointed to a single weapon type. The Thagomizer. For the first time, scientists had direct fossil evidence that Stegosaurus used its tail not only against predators, but against its own kind. And the violence of the encounter suggested something far beyond a shoving match. This was a fight to the death, a brutal duel in which both combatants sustained catastrophic injuries and likely bled out within minutes of each other. their bodies preserved together by a flash flood that buried them before scavengers could scatter the evidence. The implications cascaded like dominoes. If Stegosaurus engaged in lethal intraspecific combat, then the tail was not merely a defensive tool. It was a multi-purpose weapon, employed in dominance battles, territorial disputes, and perhaps mating rights. This radically altered our understanding of Stegosaurus' social life, dragging it out of the realm of placid herd animal and into the gritty world of reptilian aggression. The tail, with its bone-shattering force, would have been equally effective against a rival's flank as against a predator's ribcage. And if the Thagomizer could kill another Stegosaurus, a creature massively built and armored with thick muscle, then its power against a lighter-boned theropod was exponentially more lethal. But the Portugal bone bed held an even more chilling detail. The lower animal, the one with the shattered pelvis, was a female. The upper combatant was a larger male, its plates significantly more robust and heavily vascularized. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not a territorial squabble between evenly matched strangers. It was a case of sexual coercion, or perhaps a fight over a female that spiraled into lethal violence. The male's plates in life would have been flushed with brilliant color during the confrontation, a signal of aggression and dominance meant to intimidate. When the signal failed, when the female fought back instead of submitting, the male escalated to a full-force tail strike, and the aftermath was catastrophic for both. This paints a darker picture of Stegosaurus society, one in which the plates served as a critical negotiating tool, a way to avoid exactly this kind of bloodshed. The dramatic color changes, the size of the plates, their orientation, all of these were likely part of a complex social language. A dominant male with towering, brightly flushed plates could intimidate rivals without ever having to swing its tail. A submissive individual might lower its plates and turn them parallel, signaling non-threat and diffusing tension. The Thagomizer, then, was the last resort in a sophisticated system of conflict management. But when push came to shove, it was deployed with deadly precision, even against kin. Now, consider the broader ecological implications. If Stegosaurus could kill each other with tail strikes, then the pressure to develop effective defenses against such strikes would have been intense, even within the species. This explains the thickened, calloused skin pads around the hips and tail base that the Wyoming apex specimen revealed. Those pads were not just for absorbing predator bites, they were also protection against the lacerating sweeps of rival Thagomizers. The stegosaur body was armored not merely against external enemies, but against its own kind. The arm's race of weapon and armor was internal as well as external, driving the evolution of ever more robust skeletal structures, denser spike keratin, and faster strike reflexes. And then there's the trackway evidence that suggests Stegosaurus did not always fight alone. In the Morrison Formation of Colorado, a set of parallel trackways preserved in ancient mud shows at least 3 adults moving in a coordinated group, their strides evenly spaced, their direction unified. The tracks are surrounded by smaller footprints, likely juveniles, walking in the protective center of the formation. Paleontologists analyzing the gait patterns concluded that these animals were herding, their social structure complex enough to maintain a defensive phalanx. A group of Stegosaurus, arranged in a circle or line with tails facing outward, would present a nearly impenetrable wall of swinging spikes. Any Allosaurus foolish enough to charge that formation would face not 1, but 3 or 4 Thagomizers, all swinging in overlapping arcs, turning the predator's attack into a suicidal gamble. The defensive power of a herd of Stegosaurus is almost impossible to overstate. Imagine a pack of Allosaurus, 3 or 4 individuals, working together to isolate a single target. They circle, testing the perimeter, looking for a gap. But the Stegosaurs pivot as a unit, their plates blazing in the afternoon sun, a wall of crimson warning. One Allosaurus feints from the left, hoping to draw an overcommitment. A young Stegosaur flinches, but an adult immediately shifts, its tail whipping through the space the predator had just occupied. The Thagomizer misses by centimeters, But the whistling air itself is a message. The pack retreats, recalculating. For every gap they probe, there is a spike waiting. For every moment of hesitation, the plate display intensifies. The encounter often ends without a drop of blood spilled because the herbivores have turned cooperation into a fortress of flesh and bone. This herding behavior likely extended beyond defense into coordinated thermoregulation and plate signaling. A group of Stegosaurus, oriented parallel to one another, could create a collective heat sink on sweltering days, their plates catching the breeze as a single aerodynamic unit. They could also synchronize their color displays to produce a mass intimidation effect visible from kilometers away. The combined signal would not only deter predators but also attract distant herd members, reinforcing the group's cohesion. Such complex, cooperative behavior demands a level of neural processing that the old walnut brain myth utterly failed to anticipate. The stegosaur brain, though small, was capable of running sophisticated social software, a testament to the power of optimized, specialized neural architecture. And speaking of neural architecture, the sensory world of Stegosaurus was far richer than we ever imagined. The olfactory bulbs, as seen in CT scans of the brain case, were disproportionately large, occupying nearly a third of the cranial cavity. This suggests a sense of smell, rivaling that of a modern turkey vulture, able to detect the scent of a predator or a rotting carcass from many kilometers away. The inner ear structure, with its delicate semicircular canals, reveals acute sensitivity to low-frequency vibrations, footfalls, ground tremors, the distant rumble of an approaching herd. Stegosaurus likely felt the approach of danger through its feet long before it could see or smell it, and its visual system, though not binocular, provided a wide panoramic field thanks to the laterally placed eyes. The animal could see movement on both sides simultaneously, tracking multiple threats in its peripheral vision, while focusing on the most immediate danger. Combine these senses, and you have a living early warning system. A stegosaur could be grazing peacefully when a faint vibration through the ground signaled a distant predator. Its olfactory system would confirm the scent of Allosaurus. Its eyes would scan the tree line, and within seconds, its plates would begin to flush, its body would pivot, and its tail would coil into striking readiness. The predator's ambush was already lost before it had even begun. This sensory integration was the key to the stegosaur's extraordinary survival rate in a world of lethal hunters. It wasn't faster, it was more aware. But wait, it gets even bigger. A series of experiments conducted in 2023 at the Royal Veterinary College in London took the biomechanical modeling to a new level. Using high-speed cameras and custom-built robotic models, the team replicated the Thagomizer strike not just in terms of speed, but in terms of the soft tissue damage inflicted. They created ballistic gelatin torsos mimicking the density and elasticity of Allosaurus muscle and organs, then struck them with replica spikes at velocities calibrated to the low, medium, and high end of the calculated range. At the high end, 25 meters per second, the spike not only penetrated deeply, but created a cavitation bubble, a temporary vacuum pocket that expanded and collapsed with such violence that surrounding tissue was shredded even beyond the direct wound channel. The impact generated a shock wave that rippled through the gelatin, causing micro-fractures and internal hemorrhaging far from the entry point. In a living animal, this would mean that even a near miss or a glancing blow could rupture internal organs, cause massive internal bleeding, and induce fatal shock within minutes. The Thagomizer, in other words, was not just a stabbing implement, it was a kinetic bomb. The blunt force trauma alone, delivered by the thick base of the spike before the tip punctured, could shatter bone without penetrating skin. When the tip did punch through, the rapid deceleration transferred catastrophic energy into the target. The Allosaurus that took a direct hit to the pelvis didn't just get a hole, its entire hip structure was likely compromised, the shock dislocating joints and snapping tendons. Recovery from such an injury would have been a slow, agonizing process, even if the initial wound appeared survivable. Many predators probably limped away, only to starve because they could no longer hunt. This changes our understanding of the fossil wound patterns. The healed Allosaurus vertebra from Utah, with its smooth puncture, now tells a story of a predator that got incredibly lucky. The spike hit at an angle that glanced off the bone without fully transferring its energy, leaving a clean hole rather than a shattered mess. The Allosaurus survived because the strike was imperfect. But the other specimens, the shattered pelvis, the ribcage with an embedded spike, show the far more common outcome: devastation. Now, imagine what happened when two Stegosaurus fought. With both combatants swinging the same weapon at each other, the damage was catastrophic in both directions. The Portugal duel was not a one-off anomaly. A survey of Stegosaurus pathology records, published in the journal Paleobiology in 2024, found that nearly 15% of adult specimens showed healed or partially healed trauma, consistent with thagomizer strikes to the hip or tail base. These were survivors of intraspecific combat, their bones scarred but mended. The study's authors proposed that such fights were a regular part of stegosaur life, perhaps ritualized in some contexts but always carrying the risk of escalation. The tail was simultaneously a deterrent and a hair-trigger weapon, its use governed by a finely tuned social calculus that occasionally failed. And then there's the question of weapon evolution. The thagomizer didn't appear fully formed. Early stegosaurs like Huayangosaurus from the Middle Jurassic of China had smaller, less robust spikes and a less flexible tail. Their tail vertebrae retained more of the stiffening bony tendons. Over millions of years, the spikes grew longer, broader, and sharper. The tail became more limber, and the muscle attachment points expanded. The weapon was undergoing a relentless selective refinement, driven by both predator pressure and intraspecific competition. By the time Stegosaurus stenops appeared in the late Jurassic, the thagomizer had reached near perfection, a weapon system so effective that it remained essentially unchanged for over 6 million years. Evolution didn't tinker with it because it didn't need to. It was, in its context, an ideal solution, a pinnacle of natural weaponry. But here is the twist that brings us to the precipice of Act 3. For all its lethal brilliance, the thagomizer was a specialized adaptation to a specific world, and that world was about to crumble. The late Jurassic climate, with its warm, stable temperatures and abundant vegetation, was not permanent. Tectonic shifts were slowly rearranging the continents, drying inland seas, altering rainfall patterns, and fragmenting the great fern prairies that Stegosaurus depended on. The Morrison Formation, home to the most famous stegosaur fossils, was a lowland floodplain nourished by seasonal rains, but rising mountains to the west were beginning to cast rain shadows, turning lush forest into arid scrub. At the same time, new predators were evolving, larger, faster, with different hunting strategies. The allosaur lineage was giving way to the first wave of carcharodontosaurs, and eventually, the tyrannosauroids that would dominate the Cretaceous. The arms race that had honed the thagomizer was shifting ground, and Stegosaurus was running out of time. The fossil record tells us that Stegosaurus vanished at the end of the Jurassic, roughly 145 million years ago. Its extinction was not dramatic, no asteroid, no global firestorm, but a slow decline, a petering out across a few million years. The last known specimens are smaller, their spikes slightly less robust, perhaps a sign of nutritional stress, and yet the legacy of the thagomizer survived. The predators that had faced it had evolved a deep-seated caution around spiked tails, a caution that shaped the behavior of theropods for the next 80 million years. When later herbivores like ankylosaurs with their clubbed tails appeared in the Cretaceous, they inherited an ecological niche that Stegosaurus had already carved out: the heavily armed, unassailable fortress. The thagomizer set a standard for deterrence that echoed through deep time. Now, as we stand on the edge of the final revelation, we face the ultimate question. With all its adaptations, its lethal tail, its living signal plates, its herd coordination, and its million years of dominance, why did Stegosaurus fail? What was the chink in its armor that the changing world exploited? And could the very weapon that made it so formidable have also limited its adaptability, tethering it to a behavioral repertoire that became obsolete? The answer lies in the last chapters of the Jurassic, written in a handful of final fossil sites that capture the twilight of the Stegosaur reign. There, we find evidence of a creature under siege, its numbers thinning, its environment fragmenting, and its once perfect weapon facing challenges it could not parry. The final act of the Stegosaurus saga is one of extinction and legacy, and it begins with a single haunting discovery. The last Stegosaurus ever found, a skeleton alone, its thagomizer intact, but its bones bearing the unmistakable signs of chronic malnutrition and disease. That lonely fossil contains the key to the greatest mystery of all: why the most well-defended dinosaur of the Jurassic ultimately lost its battle with time. And that story is where we go next. That lonely skeleton was found in 1998 in the uppermost layers of the Morrison Formation, in a region of eastern Utah that was already transitioning from lush floodplain to arid scrubland. The specimen, catalogued as DNMH number 4138, was an adult Stegosaurus stenops, about 85% of maximum size. Its thagomizer was fully intact, all 4 spikes in articulation, their tips showing the characteristic polish of keratin sheaths that had long since decayed. But the bones told a harrowing story. The ribs were riddled with lesions. The long bones showed evidence of periodic growth cessation, and the teeth were heavily worn, the enamel chipped and pitted. This was an animal that had been slowly starving, its body cannibalizing its own calcium reserves, its immune system compromised. And it was alone. No other Stegosaurus remains were found within kilometers of the site. This was the last known individual of its kind in North America, a solitary survivor at the edge of its world. The extinction of Stegosaurus was not a single dramatic event. It was a long, grinding erosion, a slow-motion collapse that played out over roughly 5 million years at the boundary between the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. To understand why the most well-defended dinosaur of its era ultimately failed, we have to look beyond the weapon and examine the entire ecological context in which that weapon operated. The thagomizer was perfectly adapted to deter Allosaurus, a predator that hunted by ambush in dense vegetation, relying on bursts of speed and grappling claws. But the world was changing, and with it, the threats were evolving. The dense fern prairies and cycad groves that Stegosaurus depended on were fragmenting. Rising global temperatures, coupled with shifting rainfall patterns, turned vast swaths of lowland habitat into seasonal savannas, broken by increasingly long, dry spells. The vegetation that Stegosaurus was specialized to eat, low-growing ferns, cycads, and horsetails, was being replaced by tougher, more drought-resistant plants that its simple tooth battery could not process efficiently. The stegosaur was an herbivore locked into a narrow dietary niche, and that niche was vanishing beneath its feet. But climate and vegetation change were only half the story. The other half was the predator guild itself. At the very top of the late Jurassic food chain, Allosaurus had been the undisputed apex predator, but by the terminal Jurassic, it was facing competition from new lineages of theropods. The earliest Carcharodontosaurids were appearing, larger, more robust predators with skulls built for crushing as well as slicing. These new killers had different attack profiles. Where Allosaurus relied on precision bites and grappling arms, the Carcharodontosaurids used their massive bulk and bone-crushing jaws to simply overpower prey, charging in with a momentum that could bowl over even a well-planted stegosaur. The thagomizer, optimized to deter an Allosaurus-style flanking attack, was less effective against a frontal assault from a predator, twice the mass, one that could absorb a spike strike and keep coming. The arms race had shifted, and Stegosaurus was suddenly on the wrong side of the equation. The fossil record captures this transition in wrenching detail. In a quarry in western Colorado, paleontologists unearthed a Stegosaurus skeleton from the terminal Jurassic that bore wounds from two distinct predator types. The older, healed injuries were classic Thagomizer defense marks, an Allosaurus tooth fragment embedded in a rib that had partially healed, indicating a failed attack that the stegosaur survived. But the fresher, fatal wounds were completely different. The skull was crushed from above, the dorsal plates shattered by a bite force that exceeded anything an Allosaurus could deliver. The pattern matched the dental profile of an early Carcharodontosaurid. This Stegosaurus had fended off one era of predators, only to fall to another. It was a literal fossil of a changing world, a creature caught between the old rules and the new. And yet, even as their world frayed, Stegosaurus populations did not go down without a fight. There is evidence from the latest Jurassic beds of Portugal and the southern United States that stegosaurs adapted their defensive strategies in response to the new pressures. Bone beds reveal that group sizes grew larger, the animals clustering together in herds of a dozen or more individuals, far bigger than the small family units of earlier eras. The defensive phalanx became more critical than ever, but herding carries its own costs. Larger groups require more food, more water, more space, and they concentrate waste and parasites, increasing disease transmission. The very strategy that had made Stegosaurus so resilient for 13 million years began to accelerate its decline in a resource-scarce landscape. The Thagomizer could still kill, but it could not feed a starving herd. Let's talk about the plates one more time, because they hold a crucial part of the extinction puzzle. The plates' dual function as thermal regulators and visual signals required a significant metabolic investment. Growing and maintaining those enormous, blood-rich structures consumed vast amounts of energy and calcium. In a stable, warm climate with abundant food, this investment paid dividends in predator deterrence and social communication. But in a cooling, drying world where food was increasingly scarce, the plates became a liability. The energy required to keep them functional was energy that could not be diverted to immune function, reproduction, or winter survival. A recent study, published in Scientific Reports in 2023, modeled the metabolic cost of the plates and found that they accounted for an estimated 15% of the animal's daily energy budget, an enormous overhead for an ectotherm or mesotherm. As the Jurassic gave way to the Cretaceous, that overhead became unsustainable. The plates that had once flashed crimson in triumph were now a burden, slowly draining their owners into extinction. The extinction itself leaves a haunting signature in the rock record. The youngest Stegosaurus fossils are consistently smaller than their ancestors, a phenomenon known as the Lilliput effect, where species shrink in size under environmental stress. Their plates are thinner, less vascularized, suggesting a reduction in thermoregulatory capacity. Their spikes show fewer signs of combat damage, implying that as populations thinned, intraspecific competition decreased, not because the animals became more peaceful, but because there were simply fewer encounters. The lost stegosaurs were refugees, eking out an existence in marginal habitats while the world moved on without them. By the early Cretaceous, roughly 140 million years ago, they were gone. Not with a bang, but with a whimper, their final generations leaving no descendants, their lineage a dead end in the sprawling tree of dinosaur evolution. But extinction is not the same as erasure. The Thagomizer left an indelible mark on the evolutionary trajectory of the dinosaurs that followed. The predators that had faced it and survived carried forward a deep behavioral aversion to spiked tails that shaped theropod hunting strategies for the next 80 million years. When the ankylosaurs rose to prominence in the Cretaceous, armed with their own tail clubs and osteoderm armor, they were stepping into an ecological mold that Stegosaurus had cast. The same defensive geometries, The same emphasis on rear-facing weaponry, the same evolution of group protective formations, all of this was pioneered by Stegosaurus and inherited by its successors. The Thagomizer, in a very real sense, never stopped swinging. Its influence rippled through deep time, encoding itself into the survival strategies of countless herbivore and predator species. And yet, the most profound legacy of Stegosaurus is not biological but conceptual. The reimagining of this animal, from a stupid, lumbering relic to a sophisticated, lethal survivor, is a triumph of the scientific method itself. It demonstrates how cultural biases can blind even the brightest minds to obvious evidence, and how patient, rigorous research can dismantle those biases stone by stone. The Thagomizer wound on that Allosaurus vertebra was discovered in 1992, but the specimen had been sitting in a museum drawer for decades, waiting for someone to look at it with fresh eyes. Ken Carpenter did not make a lucky find. He made a choice to question the received wisdom, to measure the wound against the spikes, to trust the physics written into the bone. His work, and the work of the biomechanists, paleopathologists, and modelers who followed, rebuilt Stegosaurus from a caricature into a living, breathing, fighting animal. Today, when you walk into a natural history museum and see a mounted Stegosaurus, the difference is palpable. The new mounts are dynamic. The tail is arched and ready. The plates are erect. The head is alert. In the best reconstructions, the keratin sheaths have been restored, making the spikes look longer and more sinister. The information plaques don't talk about the walnut brain or the second brain myth. They talk about strike force, plate vascularization, herd defense. The public is finally meeting the real Stegosaurus, and the real Stegosaurus is terrifying. It is an animal that would have looked at an approaching Allosaurus not with dim, uncomprehending eyes, but with the cold calculation of a fighter who knew exactly when and where to strike. It was, in the end, not a victim of its era, but one of its most formidable survivors. That reframing matters far beyond a single species. It changes how we think about evolution itself. For too long, we told a story in which the big and the specialized were doomed to fail, while the small and the generalized inherited the earth. Stegosaurus subverts that narrative. It was big. It was highly specialized, and yet it thrived for 13 million years, more than triple the span of human existence. Its extinction was not proof of inherent failure, but of a changing world that even near perfection could not outrun. In that sense, Stegosaurus is not a cautionary tale. It is a monument to the possibilities of adaptation, a reminder that even the most improbable designs can become engines of survival when given time and selection pressure. Now, there is one final surprising detail that has emerged from the fossil record, a detail so recent that it has not yet made its way into most books. In 2024, a team of paleontologists using laser-stimulated fluorescence imaging on a Stegosaurus plate from the Morrison Formation discovered traces of pigmentation molecules, melanin-like compounds, preserved within the vascular channels. This is extraordinary. It suggests that the plates were not just capable of flushing red with blood, but may have been permanently patterned with bands or spots of darker coloration, visible even when the animal was at rest. The implication is staggering. Stegosaurus plates functioned like permanent billboards, their color patterns, unique to individuals, perhaps used for recognition across distances or as a signal of identity within the herd. The plates were, in effect, the dinosaur equivalent of a fingerprint or a name tag. A Stegosaurus could look at another and know instantly who it was, whether it was dominant or subordinate, kin or stranger. This adds an entirely new dimension to the already sophisticated social life of these animals, and it reinforces just how much we have yet to learn from even the most familiar species. As we prepare to close this journey, we are left with an image that encapsulates everything Stegosaurus was and still is. Picture it. The last herd, perhaps only 6 or 7 individuals, moving slowly through a thinning forest at the very edge of the Jurassic world. The air is cooler than it once was, the ferns sparser, the rivers running lower. The animals are thinner than their ancestors, their plates less vibrant, but their eyes are still watchful and their tails still ready. An early Carcharodontosaurid, the vanguard of a new age, watches from a ridge. It charges. The herd pivots, tails swinging in practiced unison, spikes catching the pale sunlight. The first strike connects, a glancing blow that sends the predator stumbling. The second strike follows, landing squarely on the shoulder, and the predator retreats, limping. For another day, at least, the herd survives. That persistence, that refusal to yield, is the truest legacy of Stegosaurus. Not the size of its brain, not the shape of its plates, but the simple, unyielding fact that for 13 million years, in a world of teeth and claws, it stood its ground and won far more often than it lost. Here is the outro, continuing seamlessly from the final line of Act 3. That persistence, the will to stand and fight, is the story of life itself. Across the whole sprawling tapestry of evolution, the most successful organisms are rarely the fastest, or the strongest, or even the smartest by our narrow human metrics. They are the ones that refuse to go quietly. Stegosaurus, with its lime-sized brain and its plates named after a cartoon joke, spent over 100 years being laughed at, reduced to a lumbering buffoon in our collective imagination. Yet every new fossil, every computer model, every high-speed camera experiment has peeled back the layers of that lazy myth and revealed something else entirely. A creature of devastating physical competence, a survivor so well engineered for its world that it held the top predators at bay for epochs longer than our own species has existed. Think about that. Stegosaurus walked the earth for roughly 13 million years. Anatomically modern humans have been around for about 300,000. In the time it took Stegosaurus to evolve, diversify, and finally fade into the Cretaceous sunset, our entire lineage could have run its course more than 40 times over. And yet, until very recently, we couldn't bring ourselves to see this animal for what it was. We projected our own insecurities onto it, equating brain size with worth, dismissing strange body plans as evolutionary mistakes, assuming that if a creature was extinct, it must have been inferior to the ones that replaced it. The Thagomizer wasn't hiding. It was right there in the bones, screaming its purpose. We just refused to listen. Now we are listening, and the sound is deafening. The discovery of that single-healed puncture wound in an Allosaurus tailbone was a door cracking open, letting in a flood of new questions and new answers. It forced a complete re-examination of every assumption about stegosaur behavior, from how it moved to how it socialized. The biomechanical studies that followed didn't just prove the tail was fast and lethal. They proved that the animal had evolved a precision instrument, a biological sword calibrated to shatter bone and deter attacks with surgical economy. The plate research, using thermal modeling and microscopic anatomy, revealed those bizarre fins as dynamic panels of communication and temperature control, not clumsy armor. The brain, once mocked, now looks like a beautifully stripped-down command module, optimized for exactly the tasks that mattered. Smell the predator, see the motion, pivot, strike. No wasted processing power. No existential angst. Just survival. And beyond the biology, there's the social story. The herding trackways, the juvenile footprints in the center of adult formations, the bone beds of multiple individuals moving together. It all points to a communal life that was cooperative, protective, and probably quite intimate. The discovery of intraspecific combat, of Stegosaurus killing Stegosaurus in ritualized dominance duels, adds a layer of darkness and complexity that shatters any lingering image of a gentle giant. These animals had rivalries, hierarchies, moments of lethal violence and moments of collective defense. They were, in their way, as socially layered as any modern herd mammal, and the plates likely played a central role in that society, flashing colors across the fern prairies as a constant, living language. And what of the extinction? There is a haunting resonance in the final, starving skeleton from Utah, alone and declining at the edge of a tectonic upheaval. But extinction is not necessarily a mark of failure. It is a mark of context. Every species that has ever lived has gone extinct, except for the ones alive right now, and even their time is finite. Stegosaurus did not fail. It was simply a Jurassic solution that lost its Jurassic world. The plates that had kept it cool in a hothouse climate became a burden when the air turned dry and cold. The Thagomizer, perfected against Allosaurus, could not be instantly retooled against the bone-crushing jaws of a new predator lineage that arrived like a storm front. Evolution doesn't plan ahead. It only works with what it has. And what Stegosaurus had was magnificent for 13 million years. That's not a failure. That's a triumph that most species will never come close to matching. The lesson, if there is one, is humility. The paleontologists of the 19th and early 20th centuries were not stupid people. They were brilliant men and women working with incomplete data, and they were no more immune to the biases of their age than we are to the biases of ours. They saw a small brain case, and they assumed stupidity. They saw strange plates, and they assumed clumsy armor. They saw an odd tail, and they assumed an afterthought. It took generations of work and a few brave scientists willing to challenge consensus to turn the ship around. And the ship is still turning. New imaging techniques are revealing details no one could have imagined a decade ago. The laser fluorescence that identified pigment traces in the plates is the same technology that has revolutionized the study of dinosaur coloration, proving that many dinosaurs were not the drab gray and green reptiles of our childhood books, but brilliantly patterned animals. Stegosaurus plates may have been striped, mottled, banded with colors we cannot yet fully reconstruct. The animal we thought we knew is still full of surprises. And that is the lingering question we leave you with. If we were so wrong about Stegosaurus for so long, what else are we still getting wrong? Which of the creatures currently standing in museum halls, frozen in outdated poses and labeled with half-century-old interpretations, are waiting for their own Carpenter moment? The dinosaurs are not a solved puzzle. They are a living field of inquiry, and every new fossil, every new scan, every new experiment has the potential to rewrite the narrative completely. The world of the Jurassic was not a static stage of lumbering monsters. It was a dynamic, co-evolving arms race where herbivores and predators pushed each other into ever more extreme forms. Stegosaurus and Allosaurus were locked in a dance that shaped both of their evolutionary trajectories, and we are only just beginning to hear the music. So here, at the end of this journey, we return to the image of that last herd, moving through a thinning forest, tails still ready, plates still flaring, the predator circling but never quite committing. The sun sets on the Jurassic, a pale, cool sun now, and the stegosaurs bed down for the night, bodies pressed together for warmth and safety. Somewhere in the darkness, the new predators call to each other, their voices deeper, their hunger sharper. But for tonight, the Thagomizer holds. It always held. It held for 13 million years, and in the echoes of the fossil record, it holds still. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the real Stegosaurus. If you enjoyed this exploration and want more stories that rip up the old textbooks and rebuild dinosaurs from the bones out, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell so you never miss an upload, because we've got a lot more to uncover together. Drop a comment below and tell us which dinosaur you think deserves the same treatment next. Until then, keep questioning the things you were told as a child. Sometimes the truth is sharper than you ever imagined. Sleep well and watch your tail.